Good evening and welcome. This is the 34th Winter Lecture Series. Our title this year, as I'm sure most of you know, is Imagining a Just World Order. My name is Dick Dienstbier. I'm a member of the committee that organizes the Winter Lecture Series. Other members that I'd like to recognize are Karen Dienstbier, she's related. Brendan Evans, who is our man on the recording over in the corner for putting our lecture series onto the web, which will happen. He also takes care of our publicity, and we owe him a great deal of thanks for those things. Chuck and Barbara Francis are members of the committee, Dave Forsyth, David Iaquinta, Peter Levitov, Shedid Sate, and Bob Stoddard, who is our treasurer emeritus. Shedid Sate is our current treasurer. He has a fairly new car. I don't know if there's a relationship. Social Action Committee of the Unitarian Church is the main sponsor of the Winter Lecture Series, and we partner with OLLI, the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute, who helps us with publicity and announces each one of our lectures and has 1,700 members. We, on the committee that governs, that chooses topics and so forth for Winter Lecture Series, almost all of us are OLLI members. So if you are over 55 and you don't know much about OLLI, look at anybody who looks like they're over 55 and they'll be able to tell you about it. You're the only one who doesn't know. This program is brought to you by Humanities Nebraska, a statewide nonprofit organization inspiring and enriching public life by offering opportunities to thoroughly engage with history and culture, with additional funding from the Nebraska Cultural Endowment. If you enjoy this type of programming, please consider supporting Humanities Nebraska with a contribution. Donations are matched by state and federal funds. Your support helps preserve our past and inform our future, and we on the Winter Lecture Series Committee are eternally grateful for support we've received from Humanities Nebraska regularly these last 30 years or so. We have you sign in when you come, in part because Humanities Nebraska wants to know who is here. In order to help us create and craft our publicity effectively with your patience, I would ask you to indicate by raising your hand how you found out about this particular program. For example, did you learn this from direct email mailed to you about this series? I'm going to estimate 40, 45 folks. And from information from the Unitarian Church in the January newsletter or in an email thing called an e-blast. Looks to be about 30 people, a few less than. Information disseminated by OLLI in the OLLI Friday happenings or an announcement in an OLLI class or meeting. Boy, another 25 at least. Information you picked up at the OLLI open house. I was there practically bribing people to come in one person. How much did I give you? Do you remember? Okay, all right. That'll do it. Anybody from articles in print media, newspaper, etc.? Not this year, okay. KUCV's Friday Live mentioned it, but just in passing. One or two people from the Friday Live, all right. Simply by word of mouth. Few, 5, 6, 8. Okay, the format today is that the lecturer, and for the other lectures as well, we ask our lecturer to go for at most an hour with a sort of basic talk, and then we take a break, and there are refreshments to be had, including things like coffee and so forth, in the fireplace room that's behind this wall. It's in front of me. And then we come back. Typically, there's 35, 40 minutes left until 9 o'clock. And then those people who wish to come back for Q&A return into this room. We'll signal you when break is over so you'll know. And that's just generally the pattern. And it'll be the pattern for the next, including this week, for 5 weeks. We have 5 lectures, all starting at 7 o'clock on Sunday evening, as this one has. The 6th session will be a panel that will discuss, put some closure on both the lectures that you've heard and add some new things as well. The website that will carry these lectures is the Unitarian Church website, and it is simply Unitarian Lincoln, all one word, of course, unitarianlincoln.org. So if you miss a lecture or want to see it twice, which we have a tremendous demand for that, then you go there. If bad weather ever comes, you go to the same website to find out if the lecture is going to be held. We don't expect any more bad weather, I don't think. The refreshments are donated by people from the church, the ones that are available during break. If you leave like $1 or so in the baskets that are there with the refreshments, that money gets used to support future winter lecture series offerings like this one. Also, I'm told that if you have coffee or other things in a mug, if you would leave it behind before returning here, it allows the people who are doing the kitchen work to come in and enjoy the Q&A rather than having to come in and we usually, those of you who are old hands here know that we sort of stalk around after the break and look for people who've got stolen cups and take the cups back. The restrooms are down that long hallway that you came in. If you were heading back towards the door, halfway there, there's a hallway goes off to the right. You take that right in order to get to restrooms. Most of you probably know free parking is available across Eldon Drive. So if this parking lot is filled up, the one for the church itself, you are perfectly welcome to park over there. We have hearing assistance available for people who are hard of hearing. Do we have any left? Any of the units left? Got a couple of units left. If you can't hear me with amplified as this, then get one of those. Doesn't work? Well, you can have one that doesn't work. Please silence your cell phones. Okay. We have asked our lecturers during this series to focus not just on problems, but on potential solutions to problems. And it's been a kind of a popular thing to do recently. There was a Time magazine that was the 15th of January. The title of it was The Optimist, and Bill Gates was the guest editor, and he wrote this little comment about things. He said, "The good news. Reading the news today does not exactly leave you feeling optimistic. Hurricanes in the Americas, horrific mass shootings, global tensions over nuclear arms, crisis in Myanmar, bloody civil wars in Syria and Yemen. Your heart breaks for every person who's touched by these tragedies. Even for those of us lucky enough not to be directly affected, it may feel like the world is falling apart. But these events, as awful as they are, have happened in the context of a bigger positive trend. On the whole, the world is getting better. This is not some naive optimistic view. It's backed by data. Look at the number of children who die before their 5th birthday." And Bill Gates goes on to describe other things shown by data that suggest indeed the world is a better place to live in. With that, I want to turn this over to David Forsyth, who will introduce today's speaker.
Dick has very clearly explained what the organizing committee had in mind when we set up this big picture series, rather than focusing on a particular country or a particular region or a particular issue, we wanted to look as best we could in 5 sessions at the world as a whole, and particularly noting some of the positive trends, but winding up with suggestions as to where improvements could be made. For this type of series, we could not have done better than to get Patrice McMahon to lead off. She has very broad experience as professor of political science at UNL. She took her undergraduate studies at American University in DC, then a master's at George Washington University, and then a PhD at Columbia University, that urban school that wins a football game about once every 5 years. But they're much better in basketball. Never mind. I digress. Patrice had a bit of misfortune in that she trained as a Soviet expert. This did not hold back Condoleezza Rice and some other people who went on to have a good deal of influence. But Patrice is fluent in Polish. She handles Russian. She dabbles in Chinese and Spanish, and so her language skills give some indication about her broad experience. She publishes on a wide variety of subjects: human security, human rights, humanitarian affairs, international relations in general, Balkan politics, East European politics, and I could go on, but I won't. She's recently done a very interesting book called The NGO Game. The NGO Game. She examines the hype about non-governmental organizations. And some years ago, Barbara Tuchman, now of the Carnegie Endowment, wrote a very seminal piece about how these NGOs, these non-governmental organizations, were going to replace many of the functions of states and become very powerful. Well, she subjects this view to her own critical view and made something of a splash in talking about the limitations of these non-governmental organizations in places like Bosnia and Serbia and Croatia and places like that. So she's recently done a book on non-governmental organizations in world affairs. Much more importantly, she and I have done a book together on U.S. foreign policy and world order with a big dose of human rights. And we look particularly at the prospects of the BRICS: Brazil, Russia, India, China, maybe South Africa thrown in. And basically we suggest if you think the world is in bad shape now, wait till the BRICS take over, it's going to be worse. So those are a couple of the recent books that she's done, and she's published articles, too numerous for me to recall here. She has very broad experience, and we're delighted that she's here to kick off this series. Patrice?
Very good.
I didn't read notes.
Can you all hear me? I was so worried that he didn't have notes. I worried that he wouldn't know what to say, but I guess I didn't need to worry about that. Thank you all for coming. It's so nice to see so many familiar faces and so many of my students who I also had to bribe to come here tonight. I don't know if this means I can't give this lecture again, or I should give it again and then make sure I ask some questions on the test. I don't know. We'll figure it out. Thank you, David, and thank you, Dick. I hope that you all can see some of this. I have a bunch of graphs to show you. This is a picture that took me a long time to find. It's a picture of my mentor from American University, Warren Huntsberger, who passed away a couple of years ago. And when I arrived at American University, Professor Huntsberger was already an emeritus professor, but I really wanted to work with him, and I worked with him for 4 years, even though I was studying Russian and wanted to be a Sovietologist. As was already mentioned, things didn't work out for the Soviet Union or for me in that regard. But I wanted to work with Warren Huntsberger, even though he was a specialist of Asian culture, Asian society. He was an economist by trade and focused largely on Japan, but he was an Asian specialist. But what I loved about Dr. Huntsberger is that he was a rational optimist. I realize now that there's this term, rational optimist, that focuses on economists in the market. So I decided to call my optimism informed optimists. Warren Huntsberger had a very interesting life too, and I wish I could tell you some of the stories that he used to tell me as an undergraduate to inspire me as a first-generation student to work harder. He always believed in my success, but he would say, "We can do better, and we will. You can do better, and we will, and you will." And I used to think, I'm working so hard, I don't know if I can do it. And he always believed in me. And so I wanted to start off this lecture with Warren Huntsberger and his smile, because that's all he ever did. And he always was smiling. And believe me, he had a lot of reasons not to smile. But he smiled and he said, "We can do better, and we will." So Warren Huntsberger is going to start us off. We know, though, despite all the good news that I'm going to talk about today, we know that our brains have a proclivity, have a penchant for the negative, right? The way our brains evolved, if we don't pay attention to something, it might mean the end of us. So we know this. Cognitive psychologists and evolutionary psychologists have talked about how our brains are hardwired for negative things, and we tend to dismiss and overlook the good news. Despite that, I am so pleased to be here tonight to try to get us all to think about some of the positive things that have happened in the world, some of the positive issues and actors. So this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to talk about some of these overlooked good news, some of these trends that maybe you've heard about, but you put somewhere in the back of your brain and you said, no, I'm just going to listen to this bad news, what happened in Florida a couple of days ago, or whatever it is. So I'll talk about some trends, and this is where I hope that people in the back can see some of the charts. And then I'll talk about different actors. I'll talk about different terms that we use now in international relations. Instead of talking just about states, we talk about all these other actors. We have all these new terms that we use to talk about international politics that, to me, is really good news. And then I want to end with some comments about China, I'll show you some data about China, and maybe I'll say a few words, because I've spent a lot of time, as Dr. Forsythe, as David was saying, in China since 2007. That was the first time I went to China and took 2 student groups from UNL to China, and then have traveled with my family almost every year. And I have a lot of really positive things to say about China. And I also know that your next lecture will focus on China. So I thought that might be a good way to end and get you ready for the next lecture. So when I think about some of the good news, as someone who studies human rights and human security, I think about these indicators of human flourishing. And there are a lot of different indicators of how well people are doing, how well they're doing in terms of life expectancy, poverty, food, rights. So when I think about these indicators, I know that there's a lot of good news. I can't go over all of them today, but I want to go over a few and show you some reasons why we should be optimistic that we are moving in the right direction in terms of a more just and peaceful world. We're not there yet. So I don't know how well you can see this, but this is life expectancy. So life expectancy in 1900 was about 43 years old. And now in the United States, as many of you know, we're well into life expectancy is 77.8, 78.8. In other countries and in other regions, people live longer. But look at that. And I have another graph here that shows us that it's not just in the United States, it's not just in North America or in Western Europe or even in Japan. All over the world, life expectancy is going up and is almost, in most regions, around 70 years old. also, this graph is not very obvious, but it's hard. It's looking at the decline in poverty. And poverty, extreme poverty, is defined as people who live on $1.90 a day, which has dropped dramatically in some regions more than others. But what we're seeing all over the world are people who are coming and rising out of poverty. Later on, kind of a little bit of a spoiler alert, I'm going to show you different graphs of the world over time in terms of declining poverty, and also specifically on what China has done in terms of bringing people out of poverty. Because I think that's another reason that we need to think about China's rise in a more optimistic way. Food security is also declining. Again, in some places more than others. But what we know now is that people have more food to eat, right? And I know that this graph is difficult to see. You can see the drop in decline. I think it was from 1991, the average food insecurity, yes, went from 20% to 13% in 2015. I think in sub-Saharan Africa, it's still about 25%, but still the trend lines are there, and they're all over the world. What we know now is famine is rare. People dying from hunger is rare. It still happens, and I have a number over there, but that requires me to walk over there, and I forgot how many hundreds of thousands of people are still suffering from food insecurity. But the good news is, right, the reason we should really focus on this is it's very rare for people these days to die from famine, and that was not the case in previous decades. I want to turn to this issue of violence, because that's something we think about a lot. And I hope that we have a video clip. My friend is back there. This is a graph that I think you all can see. And this is a graph that we use a lot. Okay, do you want to play that video clip? Yeah. And I'll go back to those slides in a second.
A lot of people think that the idea of a peaceful world is just distant and maybe even impossible. And we'll never get there. War is just always with us. But if you look at what's happened to war over just the course of my lifetime, it's been dramatic that we have fewer wars, smaller wars, and we have better tools for dealing with conflicts without resort to war. So we've made a lot of progress already. And I'm not one to say, it's my plan for world peace, everybody's going to be in harmony with each other and all our problems will disappear. But I am one to say we made a lot of progress in managing conflicts, learning how to reduce the size and number.
He's talking about his
location,
very
spread
acclaimed
of wars.
2010 book called
If
Winning the
we keep that
War
going,
on
if we learn
War,
what's working,
where
and we
he
keep it
argues
going, we could reduce
along
that
with
close to zero.
Stephen
Maybe we'll never have
Pinkner,
a
look
100%
at not just
peaceful world,
interstate
but
war,
we could
they
get to,
look at
95,
intrastate
98,
war,
that would be great.
they look at
We need
violence
to
in
strengthen our
general.
institutions
And
for
what they
dealing with
say
international
is that in
conflict. They're
all of
very
these cases,
fragile and young
violence,
in the
interstate
perspective of
war,
history, especially
intrastate
the
war
United Nations.
are all going
So
down.
much better than the
and that
League
we
of
live in a
Nations, which
much
was
more
better than
peaceful
nothing, but
world.
we're slowly developing these institutions. The UN needs a lot more money, a lot more resources, and it's got a lot of problems that we live with. Inefficient, all the talking past each other that goes on in the General Assembly. But when you get down to the nuts and bolts, the UN peacekeepers out in the field trying to hold the ceasefire together, they're doing fantastic work around the world.
But
if you really
we
look
haven't
at
had
what they
a
need
technology
or what's making
glitch
them
this
succeed or
semester yet.
fail, it
Do you
turns
want to
out
start that
having
over?
adequate resources
We could
is the
hear it
big
there for
thing.
a second.
For instance, there's two peacekeeping missions, one in Democratic Republic of Congo and one in the Sierra Leone in the last decade that had about the same size force, 20,000 people, but one country's 10 times larger than the other. So in effect, the mission in Sierra Leone was 10 times the resources per person as the Congo. Congo mission was really problematic and had a lot of failures. The Sierra Leone mission was a stunning success. Of course, what do we all pay attention to? The Congo, where the problems are, because our attention is drawn to problems. But if we use examples like Sierra Leone, how to do it, how to make it stick, how to bring a society from a fragile, tenuous ceasefire to some more stability, democracy, economic development, more resources is what we need for that. And the average American household pays about $600 every month for our military and the things associated with the military. And we pay about $2 a month for UN peacekeeping. If we took that $2 and turned it to $4, it would make a huge difference to millions of people around the world, because these peacekeepers who today maybe don't have boots and don't have bullets and don't have paper to write their reports on, if they could have those things, they could be a lot more successful. We know the stuff that works, but we need to give the resources to it. One of the big things we really need is economic development. Poverty is a big predictor of war. It's probably the single biggest thing that sets up a country for civil wars. They're very poor. So we know a lot also about how to work on poverty, and we've made a lot of progress, especially in Africa. The maternal health, the child health indicators, all those vaccination programs are making a huge difference. But we need a lot more of that, and as the income levels rise and countries get more stable, then we'll have less danger of wars. 21st century is a century of peace. It's not a dream.
Good, I'm glad we're still on the same slide. So what the slide says is colonial wars, interstate wars, and civil wars. So the interstate are blue, almost non-existent in 2000, right? Almost non-existent. Civil wars still exist, we know that. Here's his book, in case you're interested in it. It's a really, as I was saying to my students recently, it's a very accessible, interesting read. And he uses some of the data from Stephen Pickner, as well as others, to look at this decline in violence all over the world in every form. It's a very good read. Terrorist incidents are on the rise. And as you can see, the number of incidents haven't increased that dramatically since 1970, but what really have are deaths from terrorist incidents. So this is something to think about, but here I also have some good news. This is not necessarily the good news, but this is the reality in terms of the likelihood that someone in the United States or Western Europe is likely to be hit by a terrorist attack is very unlikely, right? Most of the terrorist attacks, as you can see in the very dark regions, in the red and in the dark purple, that's where the countries that are most likely to be affected by terrorist acts. They're not in the United States and not in Western Europe. They're actually mostly in developing countries. And as this graph says, mostly Muslims are affected by terrorist acts. The one bit of good news that I want to share is that in the last 2 years, terrorist acts in general have been on the decline. And here shows you where terrorist incidents are most likely to happen. I know they're horrible things. Nobody's disputing that at all. But what I wanted you to just make sure you focus on here is where are they most likely to happen. And also just to remind you that in the last 2 years, terrorist incidents have gone down. So here, even in this area where the number have gone up since the 1970s, and it's certainly something to be concerned about, there is some good news. The last bit of good news that I want to mention is in the area of human rights and women's rights. So this, I think, is pretty dramatic in terms of education for women. If you can see it, it talks about gender parity, saying all over the world now, girls are starting to go to school, and that's really good. There's a different gap that we're seeing now in the United States, and maybe some of you know about the gap that we're starting to see in the United States. Do you know this gap in terms of who's going to college, who's finishing college, who makes up graduate programs? Women, right? Right? So it's a different kind of gap. So again, I just thought it's interesting. All over the world, you see more females going to school, having access, and it certainly diverges after primary school when you start getting to secondary school in certain places like in India and in Africa. But what you're seeing in the United States, and also I don't have the graphs here, in other developed countries and in China too, you see more women attending college in college students, and I think the number is the same. 57% of college students now are females. 57% of students who graduate are females. 60% of graduate students are females. And I think this is also true in law school. I think it's also true in medical school, more women than men. And I think in terms of getting PhD, it depends on the discipline in terms of men and women. So I think that in this regard too, there's a lot of good news. So now I want to switch. And if you don't mind, I'll talk a little bit here about some parts of my research. But what I wanted to do is to talk about some of the processes, the actors that are involved in pushing forward some of these changes. I mentioned the idea of a rational optimist in the beginning, and there's books out there written largely by economists that talk about rational optimism. And what they argue, for the most part, is that it's because of the market and because of capitalism that all of these good things are happening. That is not my position. I just want you guys to know that is not my position. That may be part of it. Maybe capitalism is part of it. But what I really want to focus on are the range of intergovernmental, regional, non-governmental organizations that I think are also involved in pushing forward some of these positive trends to try to make the world more just and peaceful. And I'm going to also add here foundations. And I think here in Nebraska, particularly because we have such a large philanthropic community in Omaha, that's probably not a surprise to you. What may surprise you are some of the graphs that I'll show you toward the end that look at the rise in the number of private foundations and the rise in the wealth of foundations and how much certain individuals, like Warren Buffett, how much money they're giving away to different philanthropies and charities. We can discuss where these individuals or organizations are giving their money, whether it's effective or not, but again, I'm really trying to focus on actors that maybe we haven't thought about in terms of pushing forward some of these positive changes. Interestingly, David mentioned this very important article that was written by Jessica Tuckman Matthews. And when I was preparing for this lecture, I found out that this article that she wrote, it's one of my personal favorites. I didn't give it this year to my students to read, and now I think I should. I'll just add it on. They won't mind, I'm sure, right? It's this article called Power Shift. I'm going to read you the first paragraph. To me, it really sticks with me. It was written more than 2 decades ago, but it's one of the most important and most cited pieces in foreign affairs history, 75-year history, that it's the most cited. Let me just read you the first paragraph, because it's really... Okay. The rise of global civil society. The end of the Cold War has brought no mere adjustment among states, but a novel redistribution of power among states, markets, and civil society. National governments, she writes, are not simply losing autonomy in a globalizing economy. Instead, they are sharing powers, including political, social, and security roles at the core of sovereignty, with businesses, international organizations, and a multitude of citizens' organizations known as non-governmental organizations. The steady concentration of power in the hands of states that began in 1648 with the Peace of Westphalia is over, at least for a while. So it's a really interesting piece, and as I said, among the most cited in foreign affairs 75-year history. But what she's talking about is what's happened, I think, what has happened now in the world that we live in. States obviously are the central actors in international relations, but increasingly they not only kind of lose power, they hand over power to other actors for a variety of reasons. I'm not saying it's totally altruistic. And now when I teach international politics, instead of talking about states and military power and coercion and war, these are the nice terms I get to talk to young people about. And it makes me really happy. I'm not saying that war has disappeared and that states don't matter anymore. But we talk a lot about global governance, not global government, right? about how different actors sometimes are forced, sometimes willingly, sometimes voluntarily work with other actors, sometimes because it's most efficient, other times it's because they share values. So I can talk about global governance, I can talk about these regimes that exist, these ideas and norms that shape actors' perceptions of what's important. I can talk about networks, that in some area, there's lots of networks. In the area of water security, I realized recently when I was over in Ethiopia that now people in Ethiopia are talking about water networks, public and private actors working together, because in some ways, private non-governmental organizations do some things really well. In other cases, intergovernmental organizations like the UN or the World Bank do some things well. And the Ethiopian state, of course, right now, wants to do some things well, and it wants to know what these other actors are doing. So we see these networks emerging in lots of different issue areas that even 20 years ago, Jessica Tuckman-Matthew only kind of dreamed about or thought about in terms of the future. I think it's come in lots of ways, and in certain countries more than others. This is not everywhere, right? We know this isn't everywhere. We know the networks that exist in Iraq are different kinds of networks, but they're also private and public actors, right? When we think about terrorist organizations or non-state actors in certain parts of the Middle East or in Africa, those are different kinds of actors and not always doing good things, but they're still parts of networks. So these are really important terms when I'm thinking about international politics and what's changed. Again, not always perfect and just and more peaceful, but moving in that direction of decentralizing power and putting it in the hands of more organizations and more people. And I really believe in the power of people to do things. So I'm going to focus on some international or intergovernmental organizations, and one in particular, which you guys all know really well, right? The United Nations. And I'm highlighting the United Nations because that's the one we all know about, and we think international organizations or intergovernmental organizations are organizations that have a treaty and states are members. And this one is the most universal, probably the most well-known, and while it hasn't stopped wars, we know that, it's done a heck of a lot of good, right? A lot of good. And here's just expenditures on peacekeeping, and we can see how it's gone up dramatically in the 2000s, right? We can see how much more money the United Nations is spending, but we can also see where the United Nations is involved in peacekeeping, peace building, and conflict prevention. This provides just some data of the 16 different countries and the 4 continents that the United Nations is involved in. And it's incredibly large number of partners. That's the other thing in studying peace building and post-conflict reconstruction. What I realized when I have focused on the United Nations at all, it's a whole alphabet soup of different organizations that are doing a variety of different things within the United Nations, but also then with European organizations, working with non-governmental organizations, economic organizations. It really is a partnership organization trying to promote peace and solve an array of different kinds of problems. So if you can see the red line at the bottom, and it says IGOs, those are the intergovernmental organizations, about 7,500, and you can see a real dramatic, maybe not dramatic, but an increase in the 1980s. So after the Cold War ended, or in the middle of kind of the height of the Cold War in '86, there was this growth of intergovernmental organizations. And in part, it was because things started to open up between the United States and the Soviet Union, and states said, oh, we want more intergovernmental organizations to help us coordinate, to do things. And then after the Cold War ended, there was this vacuum, there was this need, especially in Central and Eastern Europe. And I'm saying this because I want to turn to one organization in particular that most Americans don't know a lot about and we don't focus on. But in the post-Cold War era, in the early 1990s, there was, if you recall, a lot of concern that ethnic conflict was going to break out throughout Central Europe, the former Soviet Union, because of what started to happen in Yugoslavia. There was a real concern that we needed to do something. And in fact, organizations started to fill in. One of those organizations was the topic of my first book, and it was the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. And in all honesty, how many of you have heard of this organization? That doesn't count. See, not that many individuals have heard of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. It was initially called the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, and then in 1995 it became a full-fledged organization. Actually the largest security organization in the world, right? Includes the former Soviet Union and most of the countries in the former Soviet Union, as well as countries in Western Europe and the United States. It emerged from discussions between the Western Bloc of democratic countries and communist countries in the 1970s from the Helsinki Accord. And over time, there were push and pull, and the organization grew, and its spheres of influence grew. What I focused on in my book was how one office within the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the High Commissioner on National Minorities, went around to countries in Central and Eastern Europe, to post-conflict countries, to try to prevent ethnic conflict. And from my conclusion in the book is that this organization, the Organization for Security and Cooperation, and this High Commissioner, this individual who happened to be from the Netherlands, and his unique kind of diplomacy really prevented conflict in Latvia between the ethnic Russians and Latvians, and in Romania between the Romanians and the ethnic Hungarians in Transylvania. And really this organization filled a unique gap in Central and Eastern Europe at a unique period in time. And from my perspective, this was a really unique organization that didn't work alone, as you can see from the title. It was this network of organizations. So the OSCE did certain things and focused on ethnic minorities, and it worked hand in glove with the European Union, with the Council of Europe, with the United Nations, as well as the United States and countries in Western Europe. So it was a really unique combination of public and private actors working to prevent ethnic conflict. But this is the graph that I want to bring back, because I think the other line is more interesting than the intergovernmental organization. Don't you think? Right? That other, like the line that goes up dramatically to, is it 54,377? So at the same time that intergovernmental organizations were increasing in the 1980s, what increased even more dramatically, right? And this is the reason why we call the 80s and the 90s the Associational Revolution, was the increase in non-governmental organizations, right? You can see, it's unbelievable, right? And these are organizations, well, I should provide a definition, or try to provide a definition, but it's not a very satisfying one, because what you're saying, what you're wondering is, okay, there's this increase in these NGOs, non-governmental organizations, what are they? Well, in fact, it's really hard to define a non-governmental organization, right? The UN has this definition, but it's basically a non-profit organization working on behalf of certain public goods, right? It's very vague. And a non-governmental organization could be Amnesty International, World Vision, or it could be a small women's organization that has only 3 members, right? So all of those things are non-governmental organizations. Nonetheless, they have increased dramatically and do all sorts of things all over the world. Here in Lincoln, Nebraska, and in countries that I have focused on, in Bosnia and in Kosovo, and in post-conflict countries in Cambodia. This increase of these organizations, they do a ton of things. And I have a list, just a short list, of the non-governmental organizations that I interviewed in the Balkans, and it's dramatic. So Dave brought up my most recent book, The NGO Game, and he's he's right, of course. He's always right. In my book, I am very critical of non-governmental organizations. I'm critical of some non-governmental organizations, and I'm critical of the expectations and the promises that are placed on non-governmental organizations. But I really try to maintain in the book that non-governmental organizations in post-conflict countries do a variety of things and a variety of really good, important things. So I try to maintain that, and I talk about some of the good things that they do and some of the areas that they focus on, but I also provide this critique of NGOs. And really what I provide a critique of is how Western countries and Western international organizations promise to be doing a lot, but actually deliver very little. And when you look at the money that goes to the small mom and pop little women's organizations or organizations focused on education or economic development in certain countries, in post-conflict and developing countries, they actually get very little of the money. They get very, very little. So that is more the critique, not that NGOs and citizens groups are bad, but just that we talk a lot about the importance of those organizations and all the great things that they can do, but in fact provide very little funding for them. And so that's what I talk about in the book. But these are some of the things that non-governmental organizations do in Bosnia and in Kosovo. Provide everything from humanitarian assistance and support for refugees to providing support for civil society and reconciliation. I mean, those are big things. Those are really big things. When you've had genocide and people being killed, to have a non-governmental organization be involved or be leading efforts for reconciliation, that's a lot to ask of an NGO, right? That's a lot to ask. But nonetheless, this NGO boom has happened in most post-conflict countries, and while there are some disadvantages and problems and unintended consequences and negative dynamics, these organizations really do, from my perspective, they often really empower individuals. And I remember sitting many times doing interviews with people in the Balkans and talking about, well, what has this organization done? Come on, tell me, I want to know. And often people said, well, it made me realize that I can do things in my society. And if you were brought up in a communist country where the government did everything or told you what to do, that's actually a lot. That's a lot to say, I became empowered. I learned that I could do things and that I could be a change agent. That's a hard thing to measure and to provide a number for, but that's still a really important outcome. So more recently, I have started, one of my current projects is looking at water issues and water security. And 2 years ago, I went over to Ethiopia to look at Ethiopia's, unfortunately, their food and water crisis. And what I realized is that it's a country of 99 million people, and about 16 million are dependent on international assistance for water and food security. This was a well that I went to visit with World Vision to try to understand how they decided on their communities to build their wells, who they interacted with to build the wells, and also how they evaluated the outcome. What I learned when I was in Ethiopia is Ethiopia's water crisis is being addressed by a whole variety of actors, a whole variety of actors. The Ministry of Water now sits down and has been doing this, I guess, for the last 5 years with a whole range of international or intergovernmental organizations, non-governmental organizations, Western philanthropies to try to address its water crisis. And even in Ethiopia, they're talking about these networks and what water aid can do that the government of Ethiopia can't do. And one thing that water aid can do, it's a non-governmental organization, is it can provide data, right? So some governments like Ethiopia are very strapped for cash. So they look to organizations or non-governmental organizations and think, well, what's some task that they can do better than we can do, or we would like them to do? And so one of the things that I learned is providing information or gathering data, or even that international NGOs like World Vision help bring together different actors who often didn't meet together before. That in Ethiopia, because if you know anything about Ethiopia, there's a lot of tensions these days with the government that is increasingly more authoritarian, and individuals who are involved in non-governmental organizations do not want to sit down with the government. So one thing that World Vision or international NGOs can do, because they have a lot of money and they have a lot of influence, is they can get people together to sit at a table and talk. And they wouldn't have done that without having those international organizations to say to them, you really need to talk. You may not like each other, but if you want to work on your water issue or food insecurity, you have to work together in these networks. What surprised me, or what initially surprised me when I started looking at water insecurity and water crises, is the number of foundations that have started to become involved in this sector. And these are the top family foundations. I thought you guys would find this interesting. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, as well as the Howard Buffett Foundation, has become very involved, very focused on water and food insecurity. So in Ethiopia as well, when we talk about those water networks, they said even 5 years ago they didn't talk about foundations at all, but now that is part of their conversation, part of their discourse are intergovernmental organizations, states, NGOs, and philanthropies and foundations. So the final actor I want to mention and talk about and show you some graphs are these private foundations and philanthropy. And again, I think this is a perfect place to do it since we have one of the largest philanthropic communities, 50 minutes, 55 minutes down the road. And I was really fortunate this week because I was at this luncheon that was given to honor Warren Buffett for the money that he was giving to Girls Inc., which is, you guys probably know, Girls Inc. is a girls empowerment organization that exists in 80 different states or 80 different cities around the country. And just last week, Warren Buffett gave them over $2 million. It's just, I guess, just a little bit of money for a guy who's given away $46 billion since 2000, right? And most of those grants, many of those grants have happened here in Nebraska, but as you know, he gave a large chunk of his money also to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundations. Philanthropy is increasingly a major player in international politics. This foundation revolution, this is my terminology, and the current paper that I'm working at looks at foundations and the money that they're investing in women and girls around the world. It's also a really interesting phenomenon for me that not only are private foundations in the United States interested in investing in women and girls in the United States, but increasingly they have turned their money and turned their focus outward to women and girls all around the world. So this is, actually I don't know what the number is now, but it's gone up dramatically even since 2012, how much money these 86,000 foundations in the United States have. But foundations are growing all over the world. There isn't a lot of good data on this, but it's really interesting in rising kind of BRIC countries in Brazil, Russia, India, and China, as well as South Africa. There's also this growth in private foundations and philanthropy. It's really interesting that this is happening all over the world. Here's a graph that just shows you foundation assets and how much they've increased. And this is just since 1997. Private foundation money is growing. There's a new book out called The Givers that I highly recommend. Another very accessible book. It's not an academic book, but it's a really good book that chronicles what he calls the era of new philanthropy. And he says it's coming largely out of Silicon Valley, but he also talks a lot about the philanthropies in Omaha, Nebraska, right? Because this is also an important area for philanthropy. As I said, the topic that I'm focused on in the current article that I'm revising and hopefully sending out very soon looks at this issue of global women's empowerment and why and how much American foundations are spending on women and girls around the world and what some of those projects look like. What I don't know, which is really interesting to me, is how effective are they? You know, it's one thing to say that foundations are spending more money on women and girls outside the United States, and we can all clap, and that seems really exciting, but I have a very critical mind, and I think, will it really make a difference? Don't they need to know the environment or know the context? How much do they invest in local capacity or local organizations? And I don't have answers for that, but what I have in my current article looks at how much more foundations are spending, and the top foundations spending on women and girls outside the United States, which is really interesting to me. And again, what I really would like to know more is how effective are they? Or are they more effective than government agencies in promoting women's rights or investing in women and girls? Are they more effective than international NGOs? What kinds of philanthropies are more effective than others? But those are questions I don't have an answer to yet. So I wanted to end this talk with just a few things about China's rise, because I know that's not only on the minds, not only on our minds in general, but because the next lecture that you guys will have will focus, I think, on China's rise. And I'm sure that Park Koppels will have a lot of different things to say, but I wanted to say some positive things that I experienced having spent time in China, but also some of the data that I have about things that have been happening in China. So this is a picture of me with some students in Xi'an, China from 2008, and then I took students again in 2012 back to the same place in Xi'an, China, where the University of Nebraska has had a long-standing relationship, actually not that long-standing, since about 2007, and it has two major relationships in Xi'an and Zhejiang, China. So this is one thing that a lot of us are concerned about. As China rises economically, what is this doing to pollution, not only in China, but global warming and pollution all over the world? I have to say that this is an area that if you read the Chinese newspaper, China Daily, and you can get it online, and I challenge you to go online, and you will see every single day there will be at least one article that is documenting some of the pollution in China. And you may think, oh, well, it's just the government. They're trying to talk about all the good things that they're doing. No, it's not. I used to read the China Daily when I lived in China every day, and I was shocked. First of all, I was shocked by how much of the news was international news, how good the coverage was, but also how many articles focused on environmental pollution, environmental degradation, and a lot of negative things about environmental issues in China. Also, to support that, is this rise in green activism, especially among young people. When people ask me about my students at UNL, I say, you know, my students care about a lot of things. They really do. Don't make this kind of generalization, they don't care about anything. Actually, they care about a lot. And one thing that my students at UNL care about is the environment and pollution, and that is true in China as well. So a growth of environmental organizations. Also, you see it even on college campuses, and you think, well, these are all controlled by the government, or we have certain assumptions and certain things are true about the Chinese government. But I know I had many conversations with Chinese students about environmental activism and some of the things that they were doing in Xi'an or in other cities because of their concern of over the natural environment. This is one of the last slides that I have. But it speaks to a different issue that we ignore almost entirely when it comes to China, right? I'm not here to support the Chinese government. I'm not. But what I can say is if you focus on economic development, China cares. Look at the evolution of poverty, how much it's gone down. China is very intentional about overcoming and addressing poverty issues. It really is, and you see it, and people talk about it. Not just government officials. I'm talking about, you know, everyday people you talk about, and I'm very interested in everyday politics, which is what people, average people think in countries that we don't tend to focus on. We talk about state policies and what governments are doing. Yeah, that's all important. But what I want to know is how does the average person feel about issues? How does it feel about poverty? And Chinese will say, we are really concerned about poverty. We're really concerned about our rural areas. We need to do that. And China has done it. The graph at the right right, is the one that people don't show you. If you take China out of the formula in terms of the decline in poverty, the line doesn't look so great. It looks pretty flat, right? China takes people out of poverty. It has. Again, I'm not saying it does the best all the time, right? But it is a big part of their West policy, or the Go West policy, and developing the western part of China that is very, traditionally has been very underdeveloped. That has been their focus for the last decade. And even in the time that I've been going to China, I just have to shake my head and go, oh my gosh, that was a little village, and now it is, I mean, more than our downtown, and that's in cities of 5 million in China. That's a small city in China. That's a small city in China. They don't even call it a city, right? It's a village. They do dramatic things. And again, I'm not necessarily supporting their methods, but what I'm saying in terms of this importance of focusing on positive things is that China has made that one of their goals, and also the current president has made environmental issues one of his goals. And if you recall, right, China is still saying we need to play a role and be a responsible power and focus on environmental issues and climate change. Other countries have not done that. They haven't, right? I mean, that's just true. So what this means and what this doesn't mean. Obviously, we do not live in a just and peaceful world. And I know you were thinking when I showed you some of those charts, well, let's look at inequality in America, or how many kids in America live in poverty, right? But I was told that I wasn't supposed to focus on those things. Those are real issues. I mean, those are issues that you and I think about all the time. The kids here in Lincoln, Nebraska, who don't have enough to eat, right? Those are real concerns. But what I do think that some of the things that I said today in terms of certain issue areas, certain actors are going and are continuing to work to create a more just and peaceful order. I want to end with this slide, which comes in part from the words of Steven Pinker, who had an article recently in the Washington Post, right, David? Right? About the world that we live in is a much better place. And at the end of the article, because he's interviewed, and basically they say, so what does all your research mean? What does it amount to? And it amounts to the same thing that Warren Huntsberger said. We do not give up. We can do better, and we will. And that's what he said, right? Stay engaged, be informed, right? And make a difference. That's what this means, right? It's not, the glass is half full, and it's going to get full to the top. Right? That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Take a break. We'll come back here, those folks who want to participate in a Q&A in about 10 or 15 minutes. And remember, leave your cups behind. Enjoy. Thank you so much, Patrice.